It began with a sound no city ever wants to hear: thousands of war drums beating like a giant heartbeat rolling across the earth. Before dawn even broke, the people of Vienna knew an empire had come for them. And as the sun rose over the Danube, shimmering red against the morning mist, a single truth became painfully clear. The walls of Vienna would not be strong enough. Not for what was coming. But how do you hold your nerve when the horizon itself seems to move? When the soil trembles under the boots of an army so vast that eyewitnesses swore it looked like the earth itself was marching? Hold that thought, because the people of Vienna were about to discover what happens when an entire civilization is forced to decide, in a single moment, whether to fight, flee, or vanish forever. Before I continue, take 1 second and hit subscribe to the History Sage. Stories like this take hours of research and days of writing, and your support keeps these lost moments of humanity alive. All right, back to Vienna, and the empire that came to devour it. On the morning of July 14, 1683, the Ottoman Empire arrived at the gates of Vienna with one of the most powerful armies Europe had ever seen: some 140,000 men, elite janissaries, mobile artillery, sappers trained to collapse walls from below, cavalry that moved like liquid fire across open plains. At their head rode Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man whose ambition was as vast as his army. Conquering Vienna wasn't just a military goal, it was the key to breaking Europe in half. And he intended to claim it as effortlessly as breathing. Vienna, on the other hand? A starving city of barely 11,000 defenders. Many too young, too old, or too terrified to stand straight. The math didn't add up, the odds didn't matter. Because Vienna knew something Kara Mustafa did not: the harder one empire squeezes, the more violently another rises to defy it. The siege began like a slow tightening of a noose. Ottoman guns opened fire day and night, throwing iron into the city until the streets glowed with heat. Buildings collapsed. Churches burned. Food vanished. The smell of fear became as common as the smoke. Inside the walls, every conversation ended the same way: how long before the walls fall? How long before the tunnels give way? How long before the city disappears? What no one dared ask aloud was the real question: how long before help arrives, if it ever does? Because the Habsburg Emperor Leopold I had fled before the siege even began. Vienna was alone, at least on the surface. But remember, every siege creates a second battlefield, one hidden behind the chaos. Whispers, rumors, promises made in the dark. And somewhere in those shadows, a letter was being carried north across mountains, forests, and war-torn roads toward a man whose name would one day be spoken with reverence and fear in equal measure: King Jan III Sobieski of Poland. Now, Sobieski wasn't just a monarch. He was a strategist in the mold of Alexander. A rider whose presence on a battlefield tilted the balance of fate. A leader whose cavalry, the legendary winged hussars, could break armies by sheer force of momentum. But the letter he received wasn't a request, it was a plea. If Poland didn't intervene, Vienna would fall and Europe with it. Yet even a king cannot ride into the jaws of an empire alone. He needed allies: German princes, imperial soldiers, volunteers, even rival commanders who set aside old grievances because something greater was at stake. And so a coalition formed, uneasy, fragile, full of rival ambitions, but united by one truth: if Vienna fell, nothing would stop the Ottomans from marching to the Rhine. Meanwhile, inside the city, the situation had grown desperate. Ottoman sappers tunneled beneath the walls, packing chambers with gunpowder. Every night the defenders heard the scrape of shovels just beneath their feet. Every morning they found new cracks along the bastions. Food was so scarce that children searched debris piles for crumbs. Water turned black in the heat. Disease began feeding on the weak. And the defenders kept fighting anyway. The man holding it all together was Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, Vienna's military governor. He barely slept. He held councils by candlelight. He patrolled the ramparts at midnight. And every time a section of wall collapsed, he was the first to grab a musket and race into the dust. But even Starhemberg knew the truth. Vienna was running out of time. The Ottomans were preparing their final blow: a massive detonation large enough to open a crater where the city wall once stood. When that explosion came, the janissaries would pour through, and Vienna would cease to exist. Then, when hope had nearly evaporated, it happened. A signal fire blazed on the distant hills. A scout screamed from the watchtower. The defenders climbed the shattered battlements. covering their eyes from the sun. And there, like a vision pulled from myth, they saw movement across the horizon. Not the enemy, not death, not surrender, but banners. Thousands of banners. The relief army had arrived. Sobieski had done what no one thought possible, crossing hundreds of miles with a coalition force of nearly 70,000 men. And they weren't just arriving, they were coming in hot. The Ottoman camp erupted in confusion. Kara Mustafa had believed the relief force was weeks away. He was wrong. He was fatally wrong. On September 12th, a battle broke out unlike anything Europe had witnessed in generations. Imperial infantry clashed with Ottoman lines. Bavarian and Saxon units slammed into the flanks. Artillery roared so violently the earth quivered. Smoke twisted across the hills. The sun vanished behind cannon fire. But the Ottomans held their ground, absorbing the shock with iron discipline. Until the moment Sobieski had been waiting for. A moment that would rewrite history. The high ground above the battlefield shook. A thunder rolled down the slopes. Not weather, not artillery, but the sound of 4,000 armored horses charging at full speed. The winged hussars were coming. Imagine a wall of men and horses descending like a storm, wings of lacquered wood and feathers mounted on their backs, catching the sun as they charged. Imagine the ground vibrating so hard you could feel it in your ribs. Imagine thousands of lances leveled forward, angled for maximum force, held by warriors trained to ride into death without hesitation. Now imagine you are standing in front of that. The Ottoman line wavered, then broke, then shattered. Sobieski himself led the charge, cutting through resistance like a blade through cloth. The impact was so fierce, so overwhelming that chroniclers struggled to describe it. Some called it divine intervention. Others called it madness. But every witness agreed the charge of the winged hussars turned the battle in minutes. Kara Mustafa watched from a distance as his army dissolved. The siege he had spent months tightening fell apart in one afternoon. His camps were overrun. His supplies captured, his prestige destroyed. He fled the battlefield under cover of chaos, knowing the consequences that awaited him in Istanbul. Vienna was saved, but victory has a cost. When Sobieski rode through the shattered gates, he didn't raise his sword in triumph. He didn't shout or celebrate. He looked at the starving citizens, the burned houses, the graves hammered into courtyards, the wailing families searching for loved ones. Then he said the only words that fit the moment. I came, I saw, and God conquered. It wasn't humility. It was truth. What happened at Vienna was bigger than any one king or nation. It was a collision of empires, ideologies, ambitions, and the lives caught between them. So what was the twist ending? You already know it. You've heard it your whole life without realizing where it came from, because long after the smoke cleared, long after the last cannon fell silent, long after Vienna rebuilt itself from ash, the consequences of that day echoed across continents. If Vienna had fallen, the political map of Europe, and by extension, the Americas would look nothing like it does today. There might never have been a Poland to ride into glory, never an Austria to rise again. Never a balance of power that shaped the world you live in now. One battle, one afternoon, one impossible cavalry charge. And history turned on a hinge so small most people never notice it. But now you do. Because you're watching the History Sage, where forgotten moments still breathe. If you want more stories like this, stories where fate, courage, ambition, and catastrophe collide, make sure to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe. And remember, sometimes history doesn't whisper. Sometimes it thunders.